This is Hope Television, proudly serving the Toledo district.
Greetings everyone. With your daily word, I am Patrick Jones. I recently read a meme on social media that boldly proclaimed that if God could close the mouth of the lions for Daniel, part the Red Sea for Moses, make the sun stand still for Joshua, open the prison for Peter, put a baby in the arms of Sarah, and raise Lazarus from the dead, then he can certainly take care of you. It concludes by saying that nothing you are facing today is too hard for him to handle. Our scripture reading today is taken from Exodus chapter 17 verses 1 to 7. Reading from the New International Version, it says, "The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, 'Give us water to drink.' Moses replied, 'Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?' But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, 'Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?'" End of quote. Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." The Lord answered Moses, "Go out in front of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled, and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" The story of the miraculous provision of water in the midst of the desert follows on a similar story of the miraculous provision of food quail and manna. Both of them seem like the stuff of fairy tales. Whether these events occurred exactly as they said or to have occurred, or whether these are metaphors for a deeper message, or both, one thing is certain: the Israelites survived the desert journey and entered into the promised land. They reached their goal. Clearly, they needed to eat and drink during that 40-year period, and clearly in a desert where water is scant and vegetation is also scant. However it happened, it was nothing short of miraculous, requiring divine providence to effect. Thus, the story of the water from the rock may or may not be accurate in its details, but it tells a truth regardless of how that truth factually played out. Because it is not merely a reporting of historical fact, it has an application for all time and circumstances. It says that God will provide for those who trust him and turn to him, and he will provide even to those who do not. Moses turned to God and trusted. The people did not. Yet God answered Moses' prayer, and the people benefited. They are complaining and putting God to the test notwithstanding. No one deserves God's grace, but these people went out of their way to irritate God, yet he graced them anyway. In verse 3, in their thirst for water, the people grumbled against Moses. The pattern of verses 1 and 2, that is, the notice of thirst followed by complaint, is repeated here. But before that, in verse 2, Moses first asks the question as a response to their complaint, "Why do you quarrel with me?" The people were more comfortable in slavery than they previously realized. They did not want to pay the price for freedom, and they wanted to go back to their former status. They preferred the physical comforts of slavery to the rigors and discipline of freedom. They turned their temptation to do so into a test for God to prove himself, and a condemnation of Moses, who is in the middle of it all. In verse 4, so Moses cried out to the Lord. Moses fears for his life and gives the problem to God. The people's faith in God on the challenge, and Moses recognizes he needs God's help. In verse 5, the Lord answered Moses. God's solution is a most unlikely one which would challenge and test human logic. He sends Moses to a rock, hardly a human solution to a problem with water. Moses uses the staff, a visible means by which God parted the Red Sea to protect the Israelites from the water, now becomes the visible means by which God provides them with water. It is not to be seen as a magic wand, but as a sacramental sign. In verse 6, God did not appear visibly, but he was there nonetheless. The staff in Moses' hand was a sign of God's presence, at least until the water flowed. God provides. If there is anything his children need, really need, and not merely want, he will provide. Clearly, the Israelites needed water to live during their journey to the promised land. And just as clearly, the desert was no place to find water. Even if they got lucky and happened upon an occasional oasis, they were travelers and would have to move on. Just how much water they were equipped to carry with them is unknown, but it could not have been enough to meet their long-term 40 years needs. It is truly miraculous that any of them survived the ordeal. This story wants to teach us that they could not have done it without God's intervention. It also wants to teach that we cannot survive the ordeals of our journey through this life without that same providential grace. This story, told down through the centuries, has given Jews and Christians alike a specific example of God's miraculous providence for them to remember and reflect upon in times of their own crises and needs. The point of the story is that if God can and did provide water in the desert, he can and will provide for our own needs in the present. That is, if we get the point of the story. It was prayerful trust. It was prayerful trust of Moses, not the complaints of the people, which got God's attention and got results. Believers, trust God to provide for you. He has always provided for me. I can testify today that without God's provision, I would not be speaking to you via this medium. God provides. Just like how Moses struck the rock and water flowed, we must be reminded that underneath what seems solid, there is liquid. Underneath what seems hard, there is soft. Underneath what is dry, there is wet. In closing, remember that 1. Abraham gave his son and God provided, according to Genesis 22 verses 1 to 14. 2. Hannah gave her only son and God provided, according to 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 11, chapter 1 and verse 20 to 28, and chapter 2 verse 21. 3. The widow of Zarephath gave her last meal and God provided, according to 1 Kings chapter 17 verse 1 to 16. 4. Simon Peter gave his boat and God provided, according to Luke chapter 5 verses 1 to 9. 5. The lad gave his lunch and God provided, according to John chapter 6 verses 1 to 13. 6. The Philistines gave gifts and God provided, according to Philippians 4 verses 10 to 19. God provides, believers. Have a great day. Then join us again tomorrow for another Daily Word.